Hello everybody, welcome to our next class. Today we're getting into the philosophy of mind. So we've got three different readings on the philosophy of mind. One is from J.J.C. Smart, that's what we'll start with here today. We've got one from Frank Jackson, and then one from another author who you've probably heard of, Alan Turing. We're just looking at a very short amount from Turing, sort of raising a question that comes out of his thinking and something fairly popular. There's a movie about Turing a few years ago, maybe you saw it. So we'll walk through it, take a look at some of the main different positions in the philosophy of mind, as well as just what this area of philosophy is really interested in. There are some clear connections back to free will. I'll be mentioning some of them here and there as we move through it, though we'll treat the two topics as somewhat separately. And in fact, a lot of what we're doing over the course of this term, I've been drawing some little connections between different pieces of material, and there's an awful lot more to be made if you're interested in thinking about them. And if you go on and do more philosophy, really the general approach of philosophy in the 20th and into the 21st centuries has been to try to separate off various sorts of issues, treat them independently, and only after that really bring them back together and try to connect all those pieces to see what kind of overall system we might have. So if you look through the history of philosophy, there's a lot of system building. People were trying to answer sort of all of the questions in ways that made sense. In the 19th, but even more 20th and 21st centuries, trying to deal with smaller areas more rigorously became really the preferred methodology. And so arguably there's a little bit of a lack of communication between some different areas of philosophy because people, specialize in philosophy of mind or ethics or whatever it might be. And so wind up having fairly narrow specialties, but there's an awful lot more focused energy on particular questions. And presumably over time, as we look forward, what we can look forward to is different sorts of solutions to different sorts of debates, getting settled on in different areas, and then those coming back together. Really the method of analysis that works throughout the rest of the natural sciences and even social sciences, and in fact is something I'm encouraging you to do as you're going through the class, to try to focus in on some little area, think about the critical responses, pick some small little area of the material that we've been dealing with, try to make an argument about some small point about it. Now, of course, if you wanted to seriously deal with even just the pieces we're looking at, you could have a response or a thesis or a particular sort of view and an argument or set of arguments about virtually every point that comes up. And that's really what philosophy is trying to do in the contemporary era. So, with a bit of that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look here at our slides. So I posted these up on Moodle as well, and I'll be creating another exercise forum next week dealing with the philosophy of mind. There again, I'll pose one or two questions and ask you to pose a thesis and then to engage with somebody else's, but we'll set that aside for now. So with the philosophy of mind, a fairly easy way to think about what it is we're dealing with here is this question down in the bottom right corner. Are minds just brains? We've got these two different words in English, mind and brain. Now, brains are just physical things. That's what we've got up here. And of course, there's a question, what exactly does it do? Well, a heck of a lot, and we're appreciating more and more what it does and how it operates, though in many ways we're still at a very early stage in fully understanding how brains work because they are just so complicated. Now, there's a funny little bit that Smart has in his reading. He notes that for Aristotle, so if you go back a couple thousand years, this question, okay, we've got brains, but what are they? What do they do? Aristotle thought brains worked as a kind of air conditioning unit for the body. So he thought really thinking goes on in the chest, and some of the other Greeks had this view too. When we say, oh, what are you thinking? Or what are you feeling? We think that's located here because that's where our brain is. It's also where our eyes and other organs of sense are located. And so we locate thinking up here, but some of the Greeks located it really with the heart. They then thought the brain had some other function. Now, just in terms of popular conceptions, that's not what we do these days, usually, although we might talk about thinking with your heart or something like that at times. But often we'll get this tension between how you feel, right, what you desire, something like that, and then what you think, how you reason or argue, or even just if you're imagining something going on up here, something happening sort of in your brain. But then if we really think about it, there's this question, well, not only do we have these two words, brain and mind, which may or may not just be two different words for the same thing, your brain, we also have two different ways of talking, just generally. We very frequently talk about how we think or feel, what are you thinking right now? How do you feel about this? Questions of that sort. Those seem to imply that we have minds, not that something different from brains, because we also have brain talk. We can use statements like, oh, my neurons are very active right now, or I'm in a particular sort of brain state, or think about anything else that a neuroscientist or a neurosurgeon might say when they're talking about different areas in the brain, how it's operating, how it's functioning. Now, there's a real question there. We say, I feel well, I feel happy. And somebody does a scan of my brain and says, oh yes, well your neurons are doing this sort of thing. These areas of the brains are highly active right now. Here's what's going on. Can we translate those different sorts of statements into each other? So if I say, I feel happy, does that really just mean what the neuroscientist means when they're saying, oh, your brain's in a particular sort of state right now? Or if the neuroscientist says your brain's in a particular kind of state, is that just the same thing as saying, oh, Carl feels happy at the moment? This is really the question we're going to be mainly preoccupied as we're working through this material. Now, there are other questions to consider in the philosophy of mind as well. So we are going to consider at least one more of those as we're going through. But really, the philosophy of mind is a part of philosophy, one of those, in a sense, subdisciplines that pulls together resources and thinking from other areas of philosophy. A lot like the philosophy of religions. When we were looking at the philosophy of religion, really what we had was a kind of focused topic, right? Okay, we're interested in religion, religious beliefs, trying to analyze those through the use of reason. And that's going to involve an awful lot of things. There will be ethical questions in there, epistemological questions, questions about what we know, ontological questions, questions about the nature of reality and what sorts of things can exist. You get the same sorts of considerations going on in the philosophy of mind. Now, where philosophy of religion, if you were to go on and keep doing it, is going to, in some sense, get its hands dirty dealing with particular religious dogmas, particular bits of theology and getting into more complex territory. Here's what people have actually believed or do believe. Now let's try to rationally analyze it. Philosophy of mind does a similar sort of thing, looking towards things like neuroscience, cognitive science, psychology, different natural and social sciences that are examining human behavior, particularly natural sciences, really, more than anything here. So some of the questions that would come up in the philosophy of mind generally include, are minds and mental events different in kind from physical bodies and physical events? We're going to be pretty occupied with this question over the next couple of lectures. This is really, you can boil this question down to that earlier on, are minds just brains? Are they the same thing or are they different things? If they're different things, what makes them different? If they're the same, why do we have two different ways of talking about them? So we're going to explore some of that. We're going to see Smart in particular look at that. Now, the second question, are minds and mental events causally efficacious? Right? If they exist, and we're going to see Smart actually says, no, they don't. Jackson's going to say, yes, they do. But there's this question, even if minds and mental events or mental properties exist, do they actually play any role in causal sequences? So when we're thinking about free will, there's this debate between Aaron Campbell, many other people as well, but for our purposes, we looked at it between Aaron Campbell, about whether or not we really have a free will in the sense that we are able to make one choice rather than another, not because anything in the world is different and thus causes us to choose differently, but because we're free in the sense of not necessitated to choose one thing rather than another via preceding causes. So there's this question, if we really have minds, if there's something over and above brains that we have in our mental life, does it actually play a causal role in what we do, in behaviors we exhibit, the choices we make, how we think and feel, and so on? Or is it just this, something extra? It's something there, it's something that exists, but in fact doesn't cause anything else. We're going to see Jackson actually defend that position. What is it to think or have a mind at all? We're going to explore this just a little bit with Turing. And this really gets into some interesting questions about just the nature of consciousness generally, what it is to think or, say, feel. And once we figure out, in some sense, what we even mean by these questions, we can start to seriously consider what other sorts of entities do or might be able to actually have a mind in the sense we're interested in. So, of course, there's always the question, how do you know anybody else has a mind? Any other human but you? Because you only experience your own. Well, generally speaking, we observe similar sorts of behaviors from creatures like us, other humans, and we then infer that they have minds like ours, which is why they're behaving the way that they do. We're going to see Jackson make use of that kind of thinking to some degree in his piece, but by just taking that general position. We conclude other humans have minds like ours because of their behaviors. Well, when we look at other sorts of creatures, like cats and dogs or any other sort of biological creature you like, they exhibit certain sorts of behaviors as well. Can we infer from the behaviors they exhibit that they also have minds, although minds different from our minds and the way they experience the world and how they think, whatever exactly that is, how they feel? Now, presumably we can for at least some entities, maybe not, right? This is an open argument. René Descartes, 17th century French philosopher, actually held the position that non-human organisms, so everything other than humans, don't have minds at all. Even though animals exhibit pain-like behavior, they're just really machines, biological machines of a certain sort. And when certain things happen to their bodies, they do things like scream and squeal and exhibit certain sorts of behaviors. But there's nothing actually going on, mentally speaking. They don't actually feel anything. Now, you could carry that same reasoning over to other humans and conclude that no other humans actually have minds. Not many people do that, but it's always this open question. Now, we're entering a pretty interesting era where we've got these real questions about whether or not machines or computers can ever have a mind or be considered thinking or feeling things. Presumably, as artificial intelligence and just sort of computers more generally get more and more sophisticated, and as we give them more and more sophisticated mechanical bodies, there's going to be a point where, I'll loosely use the word robot, can behave in a way very similar to the way a human behaves. In fact, so similar, there might come a point where, based on behavior alone, we can't differentiate between a robot and a human. Under those circumstances, should we then conclude that the robot is actually thinking, that the robot has a mind? This is the question we're going to see raised in Alan Turing's piece. Okay, so that should give you some sense of just where we're headed over this next couple of lectures. So let's go ahead and flip over and take a look at J.J.C. Smart's piece, Sensations and Brain Processes. Now, Smart's piece is a little bit old. It's from 1959. So he's certainly out of date concerning the actual developments going on in, say, neuroscience. So contemporary neuroscience is sort of well beyond what was around in Smart's day. But of course, like any good philosopher, Smart isn't restricted by where we're actually at in terms of our knowledge of the way things really work, because he is dealing, in some sense, with hypotheticals, right? Just like air. We don't have the full story on human behavior. When Ayer's thinking about, do we have free will or not? Well, there's an open question there. Will we ever reach a point in the future where, based on certain bits of information, right, what somebody's brain is like, or how they developed, or what the situation is, or what choice they face, will we ever be in a position where, if we had enough information, we could accurately predict what somebody's going to do 100% of the time, right? Now, we're not there. We're nowhere close to there. there's a really open question about how much information you'd actually need to be able to make that kind of prediction, or even what kind of situation we'd have to be in terms of information, to be able to try to make predictions, half them fail, and then be able to conclude that there just is no ability to make predictions that are 100% accurate about what people are going to do in the future. So it's always this sort of open question. Philosophers can deal with possibilities. We don't have to be stuck with what we actually know yet, because we can look forward and talk about, well, if things develop this way, then what can we conclude? If things develop that way, what can we conclude? And this by no means is supposed to downgrade or underplay other disciplines. You know, I'm not trying to say, oh, philosophers are better than neuroscientists because it doesn't matter what the neuroscience says, we can do everything. No, because neuroscience is very important. So are all sorts of other things. So is psychology and economics and business and you name it, right? So I'm not trying to say, oh, philosophy is just the greatest thing ever, though. I wouldn't necessarily refrain from saying that either. I threw my chips in with it quite a while ago. But it has this interesting role to play in the overall domain of human knowledge, where we can, in some sense, draw on everything and not be restricted by what's actually the case or what we actually know in other areas right now. Though, of course, we should be sensitive to those facts. Okay, so take a look here. J.J.C. Smart. Smart died in 2012. He was an Australian philosopher, pretty influential in philosophy of mind. This is really his main area. Also wrote in ethics and metaphysics. He was a utilitarian. He defended a version of act utilitarianism, which was pretty interesting. And along with Ullen Plass, is known as one of the originators of the Australian heresy. Now, what is the Australian heresy? Well, it's basically the view we're going to see Smart defending in this piece, which is really the view that minds just are brains. So this view that minds really aren't anything other than brains is something that poked its head in the 19th century. People started to take it fairly seriously in the 19th century, but it was really more the 20th century before this view really gained traction and really became defensible in certain sorts of ways. So up the 19th into the 20th centuries, and really starting in the 18th century, there's this other view called idealism, which actually denied that there was a physical world at all and argued that instead everything was just minds and ideas. Now that might sound pretty goofy. You might think that's bizarre, but this is part of why what Smart's defending here in this piece in the late 50s, it's actually something new, because up until the early 20th century, idealism, this view that there are no physical objects at all, everything is just minds and ideas, that view is a more popular view, generally speaking, than the view that there are no minds, all there are physical things, just physical bodies, brains, and so on. So I'll just stop there in terms of the history. It's very interesting, but it's not what I'm going to test you on. So I'm sure you'd appreciate it if I just sort of moved along and got into the Smart material here. So this identity theory of mind, this is really what Smart is defending in this piece, this identity theory. And it's a mind-brain identity theory. I throw that in parentheses. Why? Because that's what he's claiming are identical. Minds and brains. Those are just the same thing. This is ultimately the view he's going to be putting forward. So before getting to his own view, he looks at, briefly, two theories of mind he wants to reject and the reasons he wants to reject them. This is one reason I picked the Smart piece for us, because he does really well to introduce two other, at least somewhat popular candidates for a theory on the nature of the mind, and he gives some quick reasons why he thinks they aren't very good. So one is dualism. This theory just holds that minds are distinct from bodies. It holds that both kinds of things exist. So there are bodies, right? We have our physical bodies, we've got our brains, our all that other stuff. But then we also have minds, and minds are this separate other thing. Dualism would allow that, your mind could somehow separate off from your body. So you can imagine, and you get the stuff in popular culture all the time, things like body swapping with people, or uploading your mind to a computer or something like that, that somehow your mind is a thing that could be separated from your body. Even though those two things are connected right now, you know, your body gets hurt, your mind feels it. You make a choice in your mind, your body carries it out. This is really what the view is. This view is really made canonical in the 17th century by René Descartes, a French philosopher I was already mentioning. And so Cartesian dualism. Cartesian is really just an adjectival form of Descartes' last name. This is really the most famous example of this. So Descartes argued that minds and bodies are really distinct. They've got different sorts of properties. They're different sorts of things, right? Minds are thinking, feeling things. Bodies just aren't thinking, feeling things, right? Bodies exist in space. Minds don't. They're just different kinds of things. They've got different capacities, different powers, different sorts of properties in general. So Descartes argued that minds are distinct from physical bodies. There's something else. They just can't be physical bodies. And so they don't follow physical laws, at least not all of them, right? Because minds aren't physical things, they aren't physical space, they aren't affected in the same way. Minds aren't affected by gravity, for instance. They don't attract anything on a gravitational field. You can't touch a mind. You can't move it about. They don't follow laws of matter and motion. They're just a different kind of thing. Now, they might have their own sorts of laws. There might be certain kinds of laws that connect minds and bodies together, right? These are sort of open questions coming out of Descartes. And if you want to be a dualist, right? What sorts of laws, if any, do minds follow, given that they don't follow physical laws? Well, I'm not going to answer that question. It's a good question. And part of the reason it's a good question is because it's complicated. There really aren't easy answers there. Smart resists dualism. He really rejects this theory that there are minds and that minds are something separate from bodies, as he puts it, mainly because of Occam's razor. So Occam was a medieval monk, English monk, who put forward a principle that's commonly referred to now as Occam's razor. You've probably heard it in a form like this: the simplest explanation is the best one. Now, that does capture sort of largely what Occam was going for. There are some details we can get into. I'll sort of set those aside. But really what Occam was getting at is that if we can explain what we need to explain without positing the existence of extra entities, then we should avoid positing the existence of those things. So when it comes to minds and brains, really what Smart's getting at is he's saying this: if we can explain everything we need to explain, human behavior, whenever we talk about thinking or feeling or anything like that, if we can explain what's going on just in terms of physical entities, just brain states, how neurons are working, how our brain chemistry is going on, what electrical signals are doing, and so on. If we can explain everything in those terms, then we shouldn't introduce anything new and extra, such as minds or thoughts or feelings, right? That would be an extra thing. We would then have the brain state, and then we'd have the mental state, right? So your brain would be in a particular state that would then somehow correlate to being happy or sad or thinking about dinner or whatever it is. And you have to somehow see how those two things connect to each other. What Smart's getting is, you can explain everything you need to explain with the brain stuff, then you just don't need the mental stuff. Just don't use it. Don't invoke it. Look, just another analogy. If we can explain everything we need to explain about, let's just say gravity, right? How it is objects attract to one another in terms of gravitational fields. If we can explain all of that just by appealing to physical entities and physical forces somehow, then we shouldn't introduce anything extra complicated that makes the explanation have more parts to it. For instance, there's no point in introducing invisible, little gnomes or something that are completely undetectable, that go around pulling objects down in gravitational fields. That's not a good way to explain gravity. You're just making the explanation more complex than it needs to be. Try to keep it simple. This is really what's going on when Smart is invoking Occam's razor. So, we can represent dualism this way. So I've got a few pictures for philosophy of mind. Hopefully they make some sense. So what's going on here? Well, let's start just at the very bottom. There's a time dimension that goes left to right. So as we move to the right, we're moving forwards in time. And so if you look up, that correlates. I've got sort of there's event 1 and event 2. Event 1 happens first, event 2 happens after. Along the top are mental events. Those are the little sort of thought bubbles. Those can be thoughts or minds or brains or whatever you want. And they're color coded. So there's M1 and M2. M1 is a mental event, like feeling hungry, say. That happens first. And then there's a mental event after that, M2. Below that are physical events. That would be things like a brain state or a bodily state or physical objects interacting somehow. Now, there are arrows here. What are the arrows? Well, the arrows really represent causal relations. So on the dualist picture, you can have, we just look at event 1, the physical event can causally influence the mental event. So what happens to the body, right? Say you prick your finger, that's going to cause you to feel pain in your mind. Or what's going on in the mind, say you make some kind of decision, that can then causally influence the body and make it do something. Say move your arm about or whatever it might be, or recoil from the thing that pricked your finger. Now, we can also see that moving through time, mental events can affect other mental events, right? One thought can causally produce another thought in your mind. You think about one thing, then you think about another thing, for instance. One physical event can cause another one, right? One object hits another one, makes it move. And then, of course, in the future, the physical and mental can cross over as well. Now, maybe what I should have really done is put the arrows from the mental to the physical going crosswise, so M1 to P2 or P1 up to M1. Just because right now it's indicating that you can have some sort of instantaneous causation, right? In event 1, the physical event can make the mental happen immediately. There's an interesting question there. Normally we think about causation. We don't think you can cause stuff backwards through time. That's why the arrows are moving to the right through time. You can't have a later event make something happen earlier. But it might be the case that the interaction between minds and bodies is actually instantaneous in a way that physical events just aren't. So this is part of why I've just put those there, as well as just to show that the relations between these things. The mind can affect mind, body can affect body, and body can affect mind, and mind can affect body. Right? This is really the dualist picture. We've got two different kinds of things, mental and physical, and there's causal interaction all over the place. Now, there's a second theory Smart wants to reject. It's called behaviorism. Now, this is one theory that's probably a little less known than dualism. Dualism is still, in some ways, a very common sense theory of mind. If you stop somebody on the street and they're talking about how they think and they feel, and then they joked about what's going on in their brain or something, you said, let's slow down for a minute. When you talk about thinking this and then your brain's doing that, are you telling me the same thing, or are you telling me two different things? Are minds just brains, or are they something else? Right? Odds are, and the popular view has been changing. If this was 50 years ago, people would probably say, yeah, minds are something other than brains. Mostly, right? Most people, I think. These days, I think you're still going to have a lot of people say that. You'll have more people than used to say, well, no, it's all just brains, right? Talking about minds is just a way to talk, not really reflecting reality. Now, behaviorism is not a view most people on the street are going to espouse to you, but it was a pretty popular theory in parts of the 20th century, especially sort of I'll call it mid-20th century. There are different forms of behaviorism. In philosophy, there was a fellow called Gilbert Ryle who had a book called The Concept of Mind, which was published in 1959, who defended really the best defense of behaviorism in philosophy. That seems to be the kind of behaviorism Smart is really attacking here. Now, you can take behaviorism in at least two different ways. One way is just as a method. So if you're doing, say, psychology, behaviorism as a kind of method is really a way of making your experiments and producing results. So a stumbling block psychology has had to deal with is the fact that we can't read each other's minds. We only experience our own mental life. So how do you actually study something you can't observe? It's a good question, right? If you want to be a physical science, a natural science, how do you study something you can't, it's seemingly in principle, observe? Well, if you can't directly study what you're interested in this case minds, or psyches, psychology, what you can do is study what they cause. So you can study people's behaviors and then make inferences about what's going on in their mind. So you can ask people how they feel and what they think and what they're doing, and you can watch what they're up to, and then make some inferences about what's going on in their mind from that. Now that's one way to understand behaviorism. And so far as it goes, in some sense, there's not too much wrong with that. There's a stronger version, and this is really the one that I have up on the slide here and Smart's interested in. This also seems to be the one that Ryle was defending. The book came out for roughly the same time as Smart's writing this piece. So it's in the air. People are talking about this. It can be called logical behaviorism. Now, logical behaviorism goes beyond methodological behaviorism in claiming not just that the correct way to study mental phenomenon is to study physical behaviors that are produced by them, but rather claims that there are no mental phenomenon at all. There aren't mental events or predicates or properties, right? There aren't really minds. All there are behaviors or behavior tendencies. So there's what we see people do, and there is people's tendencies to do certain things. So say we want to study, I don't know, the feeling of pleasure. Right? If we're a methodological behaviorist, we know we can't actually read somebody's mind. We can't know what it's like for them to experience pleasure, eating a cupcake or something. So we observe them. We see what behaviors they have when they seem to be pleased. That includes them saying things like, oh, I'm pleased, this is a delicious cupcake, their tendency to try to go get the cupcakes when they're able to, and so on. Just that. I was going to sort of keep going, but I don't need to. So the methodological behaviorist says, okay, so study people's behaviors. If you want to study pleasure or pain or whatever, look at what people do and look at their tendencies to do things. That's really how you best study these things. Logical behaviorism goes a step further and says, that's all there is to pleasure or pain or whatever it is. It's just behaviors and their tendencies. For the sake of simplicity, following along with Occam's razor, just get rid of the mental entirely. So rather than having how people behave and then what that tells us, like what we're actually interested in, and we're sort of inferring from the one to the other, it says, just cut off that extra inferential step and just study what people do and their tendency to do it, sort of statistical models about how often people actually do this behavior out of that one, and so on. Now, Smart doesn't like this view, and I don't think an awful lot of people, especially these days, really would, even when this stronger version of behaviorism was around. It was kind of a lightning rod for criticism. Why? Well, Smart uses after images as his example. And just think, if you look at something very bright, say the sun, don't actually look at the sun, but if you do look at the sun or some other bright object, you close your eyes and look away, you'll get an after image, right? You sort of still see the thing in there a little bit, and it fades after time. Well, Smart says, look, behaviorism in the stronger version, really taken as a theory on the nature of the mind, which is just that there aren't minds, there are only just behaviors, right? And there's nothing more. There aren't mental things causing behaviors either. Smart says, really, if we take this all the way through, then what that behaviorist is really saying is that there isn't actually such a thing as the feeling of pain or the feeling of pleasure. There aren't after images or experiences of seeing colors. All there are the behaviors people exhibit under conditions where we think they would be feeling pain or pleasure or seeing a color or an after image or whatever. So ultimately, if somebody says, oh, I looked at that bright light and now I see an after image of it, for the behaviorist, all there actually is that's going on is them saying things. They actually looked at something bright, now they're saying that they see an after image. Smart saying they actually see something, though. There's actually something going on that somebody is reporting when they say, oh, I see an after image or I feel pain. that the behaviorist can't account for. So Smart accepts that I put mental events into scare quotes here, because as we're going to see, Smart doesn't think they're really mental at all. But Smart thinks that things like seeing an after image or feeling pain or pleasure or seeing a color or something like that, these are real. Unlike the behaviorist, he doesn't want to say, oh, that's a kind of illusion or a sort of fiction that we should just get rid of because it's unscientific. Smart is going to try to account for that in his own theory, but he's going to deny that those sorts of things are really mental at all. So here's just another image to represent behaviorism. As you can see, what's going on in behaviorism is that they just totally deny the mental. Right? There just isn't anything there. There's just nothing going on beyond physical events, specifically behaviors. Right? That's all there is. All you can do is observe physical behaviors and their likelihoods, and those are the only things that exist. So this is where Smart offers his alternative. That's sort of finding the good middle ground between these two theories. Dualism tries to do too much and introduces minds and mental events and all these things over and above physical events that Smart thinks you just don't need. Behaviorism tries to do too little by not only getting rid of the mental, but also getting rid of anything physical beyond behaviors that you can't observe. And again, thinking about the time, right? You're thinking about the 1950s, there was not a sophisticated neuroscience yet. The tools just weren't there. They're being developed, right? This isn't to say that there wasn't work going on, but neuroscience as a thing just wasn't really around. You had psychology, and it was trying to advance, but there were real limitations there in terms of technology and what people could actually do. You couldn't just easily, okay, not that it's easy these days, scan a brain or anything like that. So this is where Smart introduces this identity theory of the mind, and I've stuck one of those little thought whatever things and made it pink. So this time it's a brain. And this is what's going on. So this theory, very simply, holds that minds and brains are identical. They're just the same thing. Smart really is arguing that the behaviorist is trying to make it too simple by saying, oh, it's just physically observable behaviors. Smart is willing to allow that there's more complex things going on, that what's going on in the brain is really complicated, it's hard to observe, but it has a key role to play in explaining our mental lives. So really what's going on, when we think back to the way I was introducing this a little while ago, talking about just what's going on in philosophy of mind, we've got these two ways of talking. We've got brain talk and we've got mind talk. Right? I can say, oh, my brain is doing this right now, or appeal to neuroscience to say that kind of thing. We've also got a much more accessible talk that we've all been trained to use about thoughts and feelings and experiences, things like that. On Smart's view, statements about minds and mental events, claims about sensations, about what you think or feel or see or whatever, just really are statements about brain activity. So it turns out these two ways of talking are ultimately about just the one same thing, though that seems like it produces some problems, and then Smart is going to have to try to deal with those problems and try to respond to them. That's what we're going to see. So he lays out the theory here. We're going to see a few clarifications on it. And then he's going to go on to consider, there's 8 objections, and he replies to them. We're just going to take a look at the first 4. So I really, in the reading, just asked you to read up to the end of the first 4. So the identity theory, this mind-brain identity theory, right? And the identity theory is really just saying that they're identical. They're the same thing. This theory is a version of physicalism. Physicalism is another sort of theory that really just holds that all things are physical in nature. So physicalism broadly is a theory that just says if something exists, then that thing is physical. Right? That's a very simple way to put it. There are variations of physicalism, just like any other theory. Once you get into the details, it can be modified in certain ways, and there are different strengths and weaknesses to the different variations of them. But just generally, physicalism is just that view that if something exists, then it's physical. That's a good way to put it. Right? Now, the identity theory is a version of physicalism aimed specifically at talking about minds, saying, okay, what sorts of things are minds? Well, minds just are physical things. Specifically, minds just are brains. Right? That's really what it is. Because you could have variations of theories when you're looking at different sorts of things, but this is really the idea. Minds just are brains. When we use mind talk, we're referring to brains and what's going on in brains, just in a different kind of way. And ultimately, you could probably, if you had enough information, translate all mind statements into brain statements, but we're just not there yet. We don't know enough about brains to be able to do that. So, one way Smart puts this, he says that everything should be explicable in terms of physics, except the occurrence of sensations, seems to me to be frankly unbelievable. Such sensations would be nomological danglers. Nomological is really a word, adjective referring to law-like would be a good translation of it. So law-like danglers. That is, if sensations weren't just brain states, they were something over and above physical activity, then they would have a weird sort of status. It seems like we could explain just about everything we wanted to in terms of physics, right? And how everything feeds into physics, questions of chemistry and biology and so on, ultimately are reducible to physics, Smart holds. So if you had enough information, if you had a full physical theory, you could explain all physical behavior. But if you want to deny the identity theory, you could say we could explain all physical behavior and still have sensations that maybe we could somehow explain, if they connect in the right way, but they're going to dangle in the sense of somehow require extra rules or laws or exceptions to all the laws that govern physical behavior. Smart just thinks that's just unbelievable. It's too odd, right? That's too complex. There's a far simpler theory. Minds are just brains. That's it. So, identity theory looks like this. Now, it might be a little bit misleading because I'm using a little sort of thought bubble again. I have it pink just to make it a brain rather than a mind or a thought or a feeling. So in this case, mental, again, the sort of scare quotes there because ultimately what Smart wants to say, that they're not really mental. They are just a kind of physical state. But they're a kind of physical state different from our other physical states. Our brain states are not the same as our observable behaviors, necessarily, right? Though our brain states might cause observable behaviors. But whenever we're talking about mental things, we're really just talking about brain states. So what do you have? Well, you've got physical events, bodily events, and so on. Those things can cause brain states of a certain sort. But ultimately, everything's reducible to the physical states. So in this diagram here, which now that I'm looking at it, I'm sort of rethinking it, because it seems to suggest brain states themselves don't cause anything, which seems a little bit misleading. But if you think down on the bottom, you think about physical events, think about that very broadly, right? That would include brain states, bodily states, everything going on in the physical environment. Now, the reason I have it set off up on the top here is that when we're talking about the mental, right, about how you think or feel or what you see or whatever it is, ultimately that is just a brain state that we're picking out from other physical events that are going on. So I'm going to move on to the clarification Smart offers. Just keep in mind that really what's going on, minds just are brains. This is really what the theory is. So these three clarifications he offers. The first one, the is used in a sensation is a brain process, is the is of strict identity. What does he mean by that? Well, he gives other examples. He says lightning is electrical discharge or water is H2O. This is using is in the sense of identity. Look, when you say Carl is a human, you're not saying Carl just means the same thing as human. Rather, you're saying Carl, as an individual, belongs to this larger group of humans. Right? I'm one particular member of a larger group. That's one way to use is, right? Assigning a predicate to something, saying something about them, which is not necessarily the same thing as just saying exactly what they are. But when we say lightning is electric discharge or water is H2O, what we're saying is that there is nothing more to lightning than being electric discharge, or there is nothing more to being water than being H2O. So going back to the example, and Carl is a human, tells you sort of what kind of thing Carl is, but doesn't tell you everything about it. Saying a human is a Homo sapien, that's a little bit different, right? Because presumably, let's, for the sake of argument, just stick with me on that one. You say a human is a Homo sapien, you're not saying, oh yeah, if something's a human, it's a Homo sapien, but Homo sapien as a group includes a bunch of things other than humans. No, it's just the same thing, right? That's really what he's trying to do here, right? So when he's saying a sensation is a brain process, a sensation, right, seeing an after image or feeling something, right, feeling pleasure, pain, just is a certain kind of brain process. It's nothing over and above it. The second clarification. Mind statements and brain statements have different logics to them. That is, they're different rules governing their successful use. So, as I was already saying, we get trained to speak in mind language from a very early age. Use the language of thoughts and feels and, you know, mental life, what's going on in your mind and so on. We learn a certain way to talk about that. And there are even certain metaphors we use, right? What's on your mind, right? Or what are you thinking? What's going on in there? We've got these certain ways to talk about it. And you can use certain sorts of expressions as long as they follow the right sorts of rules. Now, when you learn about brain statements, say you study some neuroscience or you know, some psychology or something like that, you learn how to talk about brains in a particular kind of way. And you can talk about things like how they weigh or how fast a process is going on. You can talk about movement of a certain sort. You can talk about chemistry and electromagnetism. Right? You can't really do that when you're talking about minds. You know, you can talk about how quick a brain process is, but in some sense not how quick a mental process is, right? Or how much a brain weighs, but not how much a mind weighs. You can talk about how to measure a brain, right? You talk about like size somehow. You can't do that for a mind. You can kind of talk about somebody having a big mind, right? Sort of being able to think and comprehend a lot of things. But the statements from the one domain don't easily translate over into statements from the other domain. That's just not something we're capable of doing, at least not yet. Third, it's contingently and not necessarily true that sensations are brain states, or that sensations are brain processes. I'm just using those interchangeably for now. If we really wanted to get specific, they're not quite the same thing, but let's just work with it. What does that mean? Well, when we say something is necessarily true, we're saying it would be impossible for it to be false. So for instance, that a triangle has 3 angles to it. That's just necessarily true. It's analytically true. It's true by definition. By triangle, we just mean a 2-dimensional geometric figure with 3 interior angles. This is what it is to be a triangle. So it's necessarily true that a triangle is a 2-dimensional geometric figure with 3 interior angles. Now, Smart is saying that it's not necessarily true that sensations are brain states or brain processes. He's saying it's contingently true. It just so happens in the world we live in, the universe we live in, sensations are brain processes. Right? So, and we can relate this back to the philosophy of religion unit. Let's just assume there's an omnipotent God. Could God have made the universe such that sensations and sort of mental events and mental processes more general just weren't the same thing as brain states, brain processes, physical states, physical processes, generally speaking? Smart says yes, right? He says, in some sense, I can imagine that kind of universe where what's going on in the mind is just different from what's going on in the brain. Says, but in the world we actually live in, they just are the same thing. That's like imagining a different sort of universe where, say, gravity worked a little bit differently, or something like that, right? Or say days were 36 hours long, right? Or humans only had to sleep once a month, or something like that. We can think about those things. So it's not necessarily true that humans have to sleep every 24-hour cycle, which itself isn't really true, but just assume it for now. So it's not necessarily true that those other things are the case. It's just contingently true. It just happens to be the case where we find ourselves, the sort of universe we're in. So these are the three clarifications he offers. And we're going to see that these come up when he's replying to the different objections to the theory. So now that we've taken a look at the basics of the theory, what's going on in there, what we're going to see is Smart going through there's 8, but we're going to look at 4 objections to the identity theory. And he's going to reply to each of them. He's going to be drawing on these clarifications saying, look, I know you might want to say, yeah, what about, right? Here's an objection to the theory. Here's why it's not going to work, or here's a problem you have to deal with. And Smart's going to say, well, as long as I have these 3 clarifications, I can deal with all those problems. So we're going to go ahead and turn our attention to those first 4 problems for the remainder of this video. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the first objection that Smart deals with to his identity theory. So, the first objection. Someone may speak perfectly well of sensations but know nothing of neuroscience, so sensations cannot be brain states. This, I've already been mentioning this sort of objection. It's a pretty obvious one, which is why Smart deals with it first. Look, basically everybody knows how to talk about how they think and feel and talk about their mental life, so to speak. Not many people know how to really talk about neuroscience, right? It's a difficult subject. It requires a lot of complex understanding of a lot of different things to really be able to say things intelligently about it. I can't say much intelligently about it. I usually sort of fake my way through a little bit, but even at that, should I be talking about millions, billions, or trillions of neurons? Or synapses and different sorts of connections. Well, I kind of know a little something about it. I've read some about it, but I'm not really trained in it. I don't really know what's going on up there, right? So if sensations really are just brain processes, if minds are just brains, why is it I can talk perfectly well about my mind and my sensations and my feelings and my thoughts, but I can hardly articulate a decent sentence about brains or what's going on in brains? Particularly, I can talk about, oh, I see red right now, or I see blue, or I feel hungry. But I can't tell you anything about the brain states that, on Smart's view, are what's really going on, right? To be hungry is to just be in a certain kind of brain state or have a certain kind of brain process going on. I know when I'm hungry, I can talk about being hungry, but I can't talk about the brain state or the brain process. So how do we respond to that? How do we make sense of that? Well, Smart here is falling back on one of those clarifications, right? Smart's claim is really ontological, not epistemological. It's about how things are, that's the ontological part, not what we know about them, that's the epistemological part. Sensations may contingently be brain processes, even if many people don't know that, right? Lightning just is electrical discharge, right? Water just is H2O. Again, it's that strict identity. Sensations just are brain processes, right? A sensation is a brain process. They're just the exact same thing. Water has always just been H2O. Lightning always just has been electrical discharge. It's just not the case that everybody has always known that, right? What humans have known has changed through history. As we've learned new things, developed new theories, gathered more evidence, thought about things more carefully, we've come to realize more and more true things about the world. What Smart is getting at is that sensations are just brain processes. That's one more contingently true thing about our world. It's not true by definition. It's not necessarily true. It's not obviously true. It just happens to be true. And we're finally in a position where we're getting enough evidence together to start realizing that that's true. And of course, here, in some sense, Smart is speculating, looking towards the future, looking towards the promised results of neuroscience, which even now, we're not fully there. We're better. We're far better at neuroscience than we were, 60 years ago when this piece came out. But, no, it's even more than that. but we certainly don't have all the information yet. Right? So this is really Smart's view here. This is really a claim about our knowledge, this objection, right? Look, people can do this thing but not know about that thing. Smart says, yeah, that doesn't mean this thing is different from that thing. It just means you can know about the one and not the other, right? You can know all about water, but not understand chemistry and not understand that it's H2O. To not understand what that means or understand how that can work, right? You can understand and think about lightning and see it and talk about it and think about it and understand it exists. But if you don't know anything about electricity, right, or electrical discharge, or anything about electromagnetism, then the fact that lightning just is electric discharge is going to be totally incomprehensible to you. All right, so the second objection. Because it's only contingently true that sensations are brain processes, it follows that when we report a sensation, we are not reporting a brain process. Now, what's going on? This really has to do with the nature of language, right? Because it's only contingently true sensations are brain processes, when we're talking about sensations, we're not talking about brain processes. Precisely because in our language, those can be two different things, even though they wind up being the same thing. Linguistically, they just are two different things. Now, he gives another example he doesn't quite fully explain, the morning star and the evening star. Now, this is something that came up in philosophy sort of early in the 20th century, this distinction between the two. Now, the morning star and the evening star are just the same thing. The whole idea here that's going on, this comes from a guy named Frege. The evening star and the morning star are both just Venus. They aren't even stars at all. But in previous, if you go back in history when people didn't fully understand, what everything was in terms of the planet and everything like that, well, sometimes in the morning you'd see this particularly bright star and they say, oh, well, that's the morning star. It's really Venus, but it's, when Venus is in a particular area, you sort of can see it. In the evening, same thing. You can look up, you sort of see Venus, it's particularly bright and so on, and you can call that the evening star. Now, it can be the case, there's lots of stars. You look up, you see Venus in the morning, or Venus in the evening. In the morning, you call it the morning star. In the evening, you call it the evening star. And you don't realize that both the morning star and the evening star are just the same thing, namely Venus, right? Really, they're both just a planet. So you can have two different names and understand two different things while still be referring to the same object, right? So it's really about how we talk and how we think. That's really what the objection is about. Now, the objection is trying to conclude that because we have different words for sensations and brain processes, because we have different ideas about what those are, that they can't really be the same thing. Smart doesn't think that's true, partially for reasons I've already just mentioned here. Says this really confuses the sense and reference of words. Now, the sense or meaning of a word is what we understand by it. The reference or extension of a word is really the thing or set of things the word applies to. So for instance, the morning star and the evening star have the same reference. They both refer to Venus. They pick out the same one object in the world. But they can mean different things to us, right? You can use those terms and not realize that both refer to the same thing, namely the planet, right? Just the words themselves, morning star, evening star, implies it's not a planet we're talking about, implies it's some other thing. You can think mistakenly that you're talking about two different things and not the same one thing. So Smart is really drawing attention to this fact of language, that the words we use both have some sort of meaning to us that's sort of individualized and it might be wrapped up with a lot of other things. But there's also a reference to it, right? What it picks out in the world, if anything. So you could talk about, I don't know, we could talk about good and evil, right? What is good and what is evil might differ in meaning from person to person. Even what sorts of things we pick out with the words good and evil might differ from person to person. This is part of why when we're arguing about ethics, there can be an awful lot of slipperiness to it, because people have different ideas about what these things mean, as well as how to group things, right? What are all the things that are evil? Well, what does it mean for them to be evil and so on? If we're talking about things in natural science, it's a little bit easier because if we can fix our terms, it becomes a bit easier, right? So look, water is H2O, right? Water and H2O have the same reference. They pick out all the same things. But depending on who you are and whether or not you've learned yet that water is H2O, water and H2O might have different senses or different meanings to you. One is this chemical thing. The other one is water, life-giving, clear fluid that we've got all over the place. Arguably not enough of it, or too much, as it is sometimes the case. But you can have these different words that are actually picking out the same thing, you just don't realize. So Smart says, because that's how language works and that's how our thinking works, really the way that this objection is functioning is that it mistakenly thinks that all identity statements must necessarily be true, right? If sensations and brain processes are the same thing, then it would follow that we wouldn't mistakenly use the terms differently. We wouldn't think they refer to different things if they didn't really. Smart says, the assumption here is that identity statements are all necessarily true, that we all somehow know when this thing just is that thing, water just is H2O, that somehow we all get that automatically. But that's just not the case. A lot of identity statements like that are contingent, right? Maybe it could have been the case water was H3O or something, right? We can conceive of that. So it doesn't follow that automatically it's necessarily true water just is H2O or a sensation is a brain process. So different reports can have different meanings but ultimately have the same referent. That's really how Smart is replying to this one. Okay, moving on to objection 3. Even if mental processes are brain processes, it seems like there must be irreducibly mental or psychic, he uses that word, properties, so-called qualia, because the physicalist theory cannot account for such properties. Now, we're going to see in Jackson's article, he's going to come back to qualia and say an awful lot about it. You can also pronounce it qualia, right? It's like quality. I'll stick with qualia. It's Latin word, so there's a few different ways people pronounce it. So don't worry too much if you pronounce it one way rather than another. So the qualia, right, these mental properties, that is something like the experience of seeing red or being hungry or being in pain, right? That actual experience. The objection here is that there just is no way to account for thoughts or feelings or appearances or seemings, what it's like to have a mental life within a physicalist theory, because there just isn't room for it in our physical theories, right? There just is no accounting for the nature of pain or seeing red. We're going to see Jackson really make this argument. And Smart admits in his piece in a footnote that it's his response to this objection he fears is weakest. He thinks he's responded to it well, but he, in some sense, leaves the door open and says, this, if you really want to object to my theory, this is the place to push. We're going to see in Jackson's reading that's exactly what he does. Okay, so what's the response going to be here? Well, ultimately the response, we can put it fairly simply and then I'll elaborate on it a little bit more. Similar brain processes may have different causes, though we're linguistically trained to refer to the same processes as the same sensations. So what's really going on? Well, Smart introduces what he calls the normal percipient. He says one person is more a normal percipient than another if he can make color discriminations that the other cannot. And the normal percipient is idealized in some sense. So he gives some examples. He says, look, imagine you show a normal percipient various colored objects and they reliably sort the objects or sort of pick out the right colors. You show them a bunch of different things. You say, okay, pick out the red tomatoes from the green ones. And they do it, right? Or you show them something, you say, okay, pick out the, I don't know, green cabbages out of this pile of multicolored vegetables. You got cabbage and a bunch of other stuff, right? They're able to do that. They're able to make those sorts of color discriminations. So it's idealized in the sense that it's really abstracting away from what people actually do, and then getting this sort of ideal observer who can discriminate between, or if you think that word is sort of loaded, right? Discrimination's bad. It's not necessarily bad on its own. The word itself is neutral. Really being able to distinguish between different sorts of colors. This is really what Smart's getting at. So you've got this notion of the normal percipient, right? Now, Smart says we can define what color words mean in terms of the normal percipient. A color term, something like saying this is red would mean something roughly like, this is Smart, would mean something roughly like a normal percipient would not pick this out of a clump of red geranium petals, though he would pick it out of a clump of lettuce leaves. Right? So for something to be red means that a normal percipient wouldn't be able to distinguish it from other red objects, but would be able to distinguish it from non-red objects. And this is the general idea that there's really something going on there that humans, right, when they're functioning in their average, typical sort of way, would be able to make these sorts of distinctions or discriminations. So when we're talking about these sorts of psychic properties, really what we're doing is that we've been trained or habituated to use a certain kind of language. When we use the word like red to pick out a certain kind of color, we're really picking out a certain distinguishable feature of the world normally apparent to humans, right? Like normal or on average that the typical percipient is able to pick out. Now, one interesting thing that he doesn't quite get into here, and you can look this up. So creatures with color vision like us, you have different numbers of cones which allow you to distinguish more and more different sorts of colors. So something like a dog that can only pick out sort of like a grayscale, they can't distinguish colors as well as we can. They have, I'm remembering this off the top of my head, but I believe it's 2 cones, which allow them to pick out different sorts of colors and everything. Humans have a 3rd cone. Right? Most humans have a 3rd cone, which is what allows us to pick out more colors and have the kind of color vision we do. Now, people, typically men who have some kind of color blindness, have some kind of issue with the 3rd cone, which is part of why they can't discriminate between certain colors as reliably as other people can. There are also some people, so far as I know, when I learned about this a few years ago, as far as I know, it's all women, have a 4th cone. And they can actually pick out something like an extra million, might have even been more, colors compared to the normal, typical, average human in terms of how many colors they can pick out. So there are people out there who can pick out colors reliably in ways that all sorts of other people can't, but they don't really have any language to talk about those extra colors in, precisely because the language of colors we've developed is based on the sort of habits and activities of the normal or average or typical people. Now, in some sense, that's a little bit of an aside, but not quite too much, because it comes back to what Smart's really talking about here. We're talking about qualia, or these mental or psychic properties, things like seeing a color or feeling something or having a certain kind of idea. What's really going on? On Smart's theory, what we're really saying is that I have a certain kind of brain process happening right now. I see red really means something like, oh, what's going on right now is the sort of thing that goes on when I'm in the presence of red objects. And of course, what it is to be a red object is, in some sense, artificial. We come up with the word red or rouge or whatever it might be, and then we pick out certain sorts of things with that. So what he's really getting at is that even though we have this language where we talk about red objects or certain sorts of feelings, and it doesn't seem like we can account for that just in physical terms about what's going on in our brain, right? Because we talk about seeing red all sorts of times. We see all kinds of different red objects, but presumably there might be different sorts of things going on in the brain. We just don't know. What we're doing is picking out the actual experience of seeing red. Smart says, no, what you're actually saying is something like this. We can actually translate the statement of, oh, I see red, or that object is red, to really mean something like, and this is his terms, there's something going on which is what it is, which is like what is going on when I have my eyes open, am awake, and there's an orange illuminated in good light in front of me. There's a little bit of context. So if we talk about an after image, right? You look at a bright light, you look at the sun or something, you close your eyes, you look away, you see that kind of orange glow. And we say, oh, I see an after image going on, right? You say, oh, what is it? It's like, oh, well, it looks orange and it's kind of round and, I'm seeing this. But of course, there's no physical thing making that happen right now. So aren't we necessarily talking about this mental thing, this qualia, this mental property that itself is not a physical thing? Smart says, no, you're just talking about what's going on in your brain. Really what you're doing is reporting a brain state but you don't have the right kind of language to actually report the brain state directly. You can't say, oh, my brain's in state, you know, F1 260 or whatever. Instead, we've got this language of seeing an after image or seeing an orange or something like that. And what we're doing is really drawing kind of analogy. The experience I'm having right now is much like the experience I have when I'm awake and my eyes are open and I see a light in good conditions, right? Or you're trying to report something else, seeing a kind of red somehow. You know, you have a dream, you see something red, and you wake up and say, oh, I had this dream, and there's this, you know, red, I don't know, clown. Well, what are we really saying? It's like, well, what you're really saying is that you're in a brain state similar to the brain states you have when you see the color red when you're awake, right? You're in the presence of a red object, and you're looking at it, so on, along with clown, et cetera, et cetera. So SMART is really opening the door here and saying, although we don't do it yet, right, we can ultimately account for our talk of mental properties by using physical terms, right? Because really all that mental talk boils down to the physical talk at the end of the day. Or at least that's what we're going to find out once we get more information. All right, fourth objection, and this will be it. The after image is not in physical space, the brain process is, so the after image is not a brain process. Now, as I mentioned before, René Descartes, that 17th century French philosopher who really argued that minds and consciousness are something separate from bodies and brains, used an argument very much like this one to argue that minds aren't the same as bodies, precisely because minds aren't in physical space, bodies are. So they can't be the same thing because they don't share the right sorts of properties, right? Because if two things are the same thing, then they're going to have all the properties the same. If water really just is H2O or lightning just is electrical discharge, then everything that's true of electrical discharge will be true of lightning. Everything true of H2O will be true of water. In this case, we found something that's true of one, right? True of the sensation, the after image, not true of the other thing, the brain process. So if they don't share all the properties, they can't be the same thing. SMART responds to this one as well. And this picks up on really what he was trying to talk about in the previous slide and the previous objection there. So ultimately, SMART says what he's arguing for is that the experience of having an after image is a brain process, not that the after image itself is a brain process. So the brain process can have different properties than the experience of having it produces for us. So look, this really boils down to saying something like this, and we're going to see that Jackson in some sense picks up on this issue and produces a whole argument about it, which SMART might try to respond to just with the material right here anyways. It's something like this. When we're thinking about what sorts of properties something has, we've got to keep in mind exactly what we're talking about. If we're talking about a brain process that we're not experiencing, somebody else's brain process or just a brain process in general, we can talk about it and what it's like and that it's in space and has these sorts of properties and so on, but it's something different to experience the brain process, to be the sort of thing having that brain process at a given time, rather than merely describing that process independently of actually having it. So what SMART's getting at here, the after image, he's not saying that the after image itself is a brain process. What he's saying is that the experience of having the after image is a brain process. Now the after image itself, in a lot of ways, isn't real. So when you look at something bright, you close your eyes and you see this after image there. The after image itself doesn't really exist. It's not this thing that's out there that you're seeing, right? Not like a normal physical object. When we normally, if you just look around, say right now you're seeing this video. The video's real, right? That's what you're seeing. But of course, if you later, imagine watching the video or have some kind of memory of it, you're in a different kind of situation there. You're no longer actually seeing the real video. You're experiencing a memory of it or some kind of imagining, which would involve some different but similar, presumably, sort of brain process or brain state than you'd actually be in while you're really watching. So there's a brain process associated with, say, looking at a bright light. There's another brain process that you'd be in if you're just seeing the after image of the bright light. Now, the after image itself isn't real in the sense that it's not really out there. It's not this external physical thing that you're actually looking at. Rather, the experience of having the after image itself is really just a report of what's going on in your brain at the given time. Now, because we don't have the language yet to really talk about brain processes, the way we talk about them for something like an afterimage or another phenomenon that isn't really out there, right? You know, if you're just talking about your own feeling or thought or something, there's not some physical object out in the world other people can look at and be like, oh, right, there's books over on that shelf, right? There are really books, and I can talk about them, and you know, you can go and pick them up and do stuff with them. When I talk about how I think or how I feel, you can't do that. Why? Because I'm just describing what state my brain is in, which you can't experience of mine, right? Not like the object, which is the shared physical object out in the world that we can both do something with. What's going on in my brain and how I experience that is something private. But I can try to communicate to you what's going on there by using this, as Smart sort of calls it, indirect object language, right? So we use the language of material objects to talk about what's going on in our mental life, just in an indirect way. We're really drawing analogies of a certain sort. So of course, it's not going to be perfect, and you're not going to have all the same properties carrying over from one to the other, because in some sense, we're not speaking in literal truths when we're talking about seeing an after image or feeling a pain or something like that. Because really what we're trying to do is report being in a particular kind of brain state without having the right kind of language to say precisely what it is that's actually going on. So that really takes us through Smart's piece. So in next class, we're going to take a look at Jackson's defense of really qualia. So he's going to argue that there really are these irreducible mental properties and give us some arguments really against Smart's view. Now, an interesting thing about Jackson's piece, we're going to see him argue there really are mental properties. You can't account for everything just in terms of brains. Although he doesn't think those mental properties are actually causally efficacious. So he defends that minds really are something over and above brains, but he agrees with Smart, even though Smart isn't really highlighting it here, that minds and mental properties actually have no causal role to play in the world that we live in. So we'll take a look at that next time. We'll also take a look at just that little bit of Alan Turing and really just raise this question of can machines or sort of non-human creatures think? What would it be for them to think? That's really what we're going to see out of Turing, his way of formulating that question. He's got a particular way of saying, here's really what's going on when we're asking the question, can somebody think or not? So I'll pick that up in the next video. I hope this has been clear. If you've got any questions, feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video next week. Have a good weekend.